Please give a warm welcome to Karen Straughan.
Were you drunk when you seemed so hopeful before? Have you gone to sleep and woken up green and pale in fear of this idea? From now on, this is what I'll think of your love. Are you afraid to act the way you desire? Will you take the crown you want so badly, or will you live as a coward, always saying, I can't, after you say, I want to? You're like the poor cat in the old story. To which Macbeth said, please stop. I dare to do only what is proper for a man to do. He who dares to do more is not a man at all. To which his wife said, if you weren't a man, then what kind of animal were you when you first told me you wanted to do this? When you dared to do it, that's when you were a man. I have suckled a baby, and I know how sweet it is to love the baby at my breast. But even as the baby was smiling up at me, I would have plucked my nipple out of its mouth and smashed its brains out against a wall if I had sworn to do the same the way you have sworn to do this. So, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, SFU, Advocacy for Men and Boys Society. Thank you for arranging this event, and thank you, Theron, for recommending the topic for the presentation. I'm not sure if I've ever been handed a more thorny topic to discuss, and I'm going to try to do my best to keep it clean and fair and level-headed and rational. I know the opening really didn't seem that way, but Theron had sort of a sauce for gooses and ganders in mind when she decided that this should be the topic that I discuss, and I really can't blame her. Toxic masculinity is such a commonly discussed and abused notion. It barely rates a raised eyebrow when it comes up in conversation. On the other hand, toxic femininity is a taboo subject. It's been so long taboo. I could probably convince a lot of ordinary people that it's a brand new idea. Never been discussed before, never even been conceived of. Most of the people who talk about toxic femininity are called misogynists. Most of the people who talk about toxic masculinity identify as feminists. So, I'm going to start with toxic masculinity and try and describe what the average feminist is talking about when she's talking about this. I'm almost positive, despite how feminist rhetoric often comes across, that they wouldn't define it as the notion that all masculine traits are harmful to men or to other people. They would define it as a complex of ideals, expectations, and behaviors intrinsic to masculinity and supported by the culture that are encapsulated in the phrase, patriarchy hurts men too. To quote the website Geek Feminism, which was the first Google hit that I got when I searched for Toxic Masculinity 101. Toxic masculinity is a set of socially constructed attitudes that describe the masculine gender role as violent, unemotional, sexually aggressive, and so forth. Now, Geek Feminism is an interesting website in the number and degree of the contradictions I found there. So I'm going to take you through a few of their examples of these socially constructed attitudes of toxic masculinity. The first one on the list, the pervasive idea that male-female interactions are a competition rather than cooperation. I don't know about you, and no, I'm not a traditionalist, but the basis of traditional gender roles was always one of complementarianism, not competition. Patriarchy was about male-female cooperation. Division of labor and roles was considered an essential part of marriage, as much so as it would be considered an essential part of a football team, because that's what traditional family was a team. The majority of both men and women in traditional societies in our past and in our present world today, people who live in traditional societies, they all tend to share this outlook of cooperation and complementarianism. Husbands and wives are encouraged to embrace different but equally important roles precisely so that male-female interactions never become a competition. And one of the things that exemplifies this is the love, honor, and obey versus love, honor, and cherish. And oh, how the feminists of yesteryear railed against that one little difference. The admonition that women obey their husbands was considered demeaning, subjugating, and oppressive. But let's look at the other side of the equation through Ephesians 5:25, just a couple of verses away. Husbands, love your wives as the Messiah loves his church and gave himself up for her sake. In other words, be prepared to die for your wife. Be prepared to sacrifice everything for her. For centuries, these complementary roles of men and women were taken as a given by both men and women. Then in 1848, a group of angry, mostly privileged, mostly upper middle class white women descended on the town of Seneca Falls in New York and produced a list of grievances, essentially declaring war between men and women. In it, they described the history of humanity to be one of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman. And in response to this growing trend, which grew from that meeting, anti-suffragettes writing to the Illinois legislature in 1909 had this to say: "It is our fathers, brothers, and sons who represent us at the ballot box. Our fathers and our brothers love us. Our husbands are our choice and are one with us. Our sons are what we make them. We are content that they represent us in the cornfield, on the battlefield, and at the ballot box, and we them in the schoolroom, at the fireside, and at the cradle." Of course, such an attitude of cooperation rather than competition requires that a woman respect and have affection for and trust in her husband and the other men in her life. It requires an ethic of care and reciprocity by men toward their women, and a spirit of mutual human destiny, whereby it is understood that any harm to a woman will be felt as a harm to the men in her life, and any harm to a man will be similarly felt by the women in his life. In 1909, no less than 1848, this was the attitude of the overwhelming majority of both men and women. Feminists have always been a minority. And that attitude boils down to the sexes are not in competition. The sexes are meant to cooperate with each other in their own way. The declaration of sentiments out of Seneca Falls was the opening salvo in what has become 165 years of gender warfare. Yet somehow, in 2015, feminists are claiming that a competitive view of gender relations is a traditional patriarchal norm. So, next on the list of geek feminism's examples of toxic masculinity, the pervasive idea that men cannot truly understand women, and vice versa, and following that, no true companionship can be had between the sexes. I have one word for you: mansplaining. Or how about this? You have no idea what it's like to be a woman. Check your male privilege. I hear this kind of thing from feminists all the time. I also hear lots of talk about women's common lived experience, sisterhood, and women's ways of knowing, all from feminists. I hear lots of talk about women being able to bring something different to the table regarding politics or corporate boards or questions of ethics and policy, as if men can't be trusted to understand where women are coming from in terms of being capable of representing their interests. Can you guess who tends to talk like that? So, moving on. The next item, the idea that a real man cannot be a victim of abuse, or that talking about it is shameful. I could take this time to cite the dozens, hundreds of examples of feminist scholars who have for decades minimized or concealed altogether the prevalence of male victims of intimate partner violence. I could take this time to explain how noted feminist sexual violence expert Mary Koss excluded male victims of female sexual violence by definition during her tenure as a consultant with the CDC. I could show you screenshots of thousands of comments I've read by feminists and others, insisting that female on male abuse is infinitesimally rare. And if it isn't, well, it's just different. It's not as bad. It's not institutionalized. It's not systemic. It's not as potentially lethal, and it's not as supported by patriarchy. Or even just because reasons. I could tell you how Erin Pizzey was forced to flee her home and her country by a concerted decade-long harassment campaign by feminists, all for daring to say that women are sometimes violent too and men are sometimes their victims. And how the mere idea of that inflamed militant feminists to the point of bomb and death threats. I could detail the travails of Murray Strauss and his brave colleagues like Suzanne Steinmetz, who were the first to publish research demonstrating gender symmetry in intimate partner violence, and name what group it was that put them through that gamut of abuse: shunning, blacklisting, threats, false accusations, and career sabotage. But I don't think you need me to. It seems to me that within feminism's paradigm, men cannot be considered real victims of abuse. At least they can't if they want to be considered real men. And they certainly aren't considered equally deserving of consideration and concern. And that talking about male abuse in feminist circles is not considered shameful, it's considered punishable. And if you challenge their attitudes in any real way, you're probably going to get called a whiny, crybaby loser who lives in his mother's basement and can't get laid. That is, you're not a real man. So, moving on. How about this one? Men are just like that. The expectation that real men are keenly interested in sex, want to have sex, and are ready to have sex most, if not all, the time. And here I'm just going to quote feminist Mary Koss's justification for excluding forced envelopment from the category of rape in the CDC's research on intimate partner and sexual violence. Although men may sometimes sexually penetrate women when ambivalent about their own desires, ... Ambivalent about their own desires. Sounds a lot like she's saying, well, they actually really wanted it. They just didn't realize they wanted it, but they pretty much wanted it. The next one. Though not reinforced much in fictional media, in real life, it is widely expected that a man would abandon his pregnant girlfriend and is incapable and/or unwilling to take responsibility. This is a really interesting one, considering they're saying it's a patriarchal, toxic, masculine norm. The traditional function of marriage has always been to accurately identify the fathers of children and hold those fathers responsible financially and practically for the support and well-being of those children and their mothers. Think about shotgun weddings. He'll do his duty by her. Then there's the fact that our entire legal and bureaucratic structure around men and family is poised to assign and enforce patriarchal responsibility for the family. It's money. Even on men who did not consent to become fathers, and appallingly, even on men who did not consent to the act that made them become fathers. Such as the 14-year-old boy in the US who was raped by a 35-year-old woman, a crime for which she served 2 years in prison, and who was then forced to pay her child support out of his paper route. The hard and statistically supported truth is that non-custodial mothers, though less numerous overall, are more likely than non-custodial fathers to be in arrears on child support, are more likely to refuse to pay it altogether, and are at the same time less likely to be jailed for it. And the judges and legislators responsible for all of this, mostly men, progressive and conservative, enforcing traditionally masculine responsibilities on other men. I don't know if you all remember Obama's Father's Day address a few years ago, where he chastised black fathers for being deadbeats. I'm Just surprised he wasn't wearing his "This is what a feminist looks like" t-shirt when he did that. The masculinity men expect from each other, and the masculinity they have expected from each other for millennia is one that rigidly enforces paternal responsibility. So if it's assumed that men will try and cheese out on that responsibility, it's certainly not allowed. Not under patriarchy, not under traditional systems, not by society, not by other men, certainly not within the feminist realm. And in fact, legal paternal surrender, that is the right of a man to refuse the obligations of parenthood if he did not consent to become a father, is one of the most heatedly opposed policy changes men's rights activists suggest to anybody. It's opposed by the vast majority of both traditional conservatives and progressive feminists. Meanwhile, there are hundreds of thousands of fathers across the West who are financially supporting their children while simultaneously being denied reasonable access to them by their mothers with the tacit support of lackadaisical, apathetic family courts. And what does the largest feminist organization in the US, the National Organization for Women, have to say about fathers' rights groups? They're an abuser's lobby campaigning for more effective paternal custody and access rights, not out of love for their children or a sense of responsibility to provide them with nurturance and support, but out of a desire to abuse and harass their estranged spouses and partners or to get out of paying child support. Sounds like toxic masculinity to me. Meanwhile, a 2008 study out of Indiana University reported, contrary to stereotypes about sexual performance and masculinity, men interviewed in a large international study reported that being seen as honorable, self-reliant, and respected was more important to their ideals of masculinity than the being seen as attractive, sexually active, or successful with women, regardless of age or nationality. And this asked men in Brazil, in Italy, all over the place. The men more frequently ranked good health, harmonious family life, and good relations with their wife or partner as more important to their quality of life than material, self-fulfilling, or purely sexual concerns. So, I seem to be seeing a pattern here. I seem to be seeing a pattern that feminists define toxic masculinity based on their attitudes toward men. Not how men are, not how men behave, not the expectations that men have of each other or that society has of men, but how feminists think of men. I want to go a layer or three deeper, though, than feminists tend to in my discussion of toxic gender norms, because clearly, as I outlined above, these ladies really haven't thought the whole thing through. After all, if they oppose toxic masculinity because patriarchy hurts men too and want to change and challenge the attitudes that lead to it, they probably wouldn't be among the worst offenders when it comes to enforcing, endorsing, and normalizing them, would they? Think about it. Even Fox News will admit that fathers get a shit deal these days in family court and too often lose meaningful relationships with their children for no good reason. It's only feminists who claim that men fighting for their right to remain fathers to their children are probably violent abusers or are only attempting to avoid their proper responsibility by faking a greater interest in day-to-day caring roles. So down we go into the mess of things. Going a little deeper, the causes become simpler, even as the outcomes become more diverse. What feminists claim are the expectations that real men should be violent, unemotional, and sexually aggressive, we will look at in other terms. Men are expected to be competent actors. Violence is a form of action. Sexual aggression, or in the less extreme case of sexual assertiveness, maybe sexual proceptivity, is a form of action. And emotional mastery, despite what feminists will tell you about women's greater emotional intelligence, is actually a form of competence. I would suggest to everyone here, when you go home tonight, and this is actually a really, really interesting thing, do a search on YouTube. A good term would be everyday heroes or real life heroes. There are several compilations out there. Most of them have gone viral. All of people, mostly men, doing things big or small, risky, or even just thoughtful, to help out people they don't even know. In one scene, I recall, an elderly woman was standing in a blizzard, kind of on a freeway on-ramp in Eastern Europe. And a man stopped his car, put it right in the middle of the road, stopped it, put his hazards on, got out of the car, went to her, took her by the elbow, and helped her cross the street, and then got back in his car and drove away. In another scene, a man waiting for the subway passed out and fell onto the tracks. Dozens of women on the platform started frantically trying to flag down the train. But it was the man who jumped down, a man who jumped down on the tracks, and it was another man who helped him pull the unconscious guy to safety. Mostly male bystanders rushing in to rescue a motorcyclist who's pinned under a burning car. A truck stalled on some railway tracks, and the guy in the car behind him jumps out and pushes it out of the way, barely in time to not get hit by the train himself. These are things that guys do. And one thing you will notice when you watch these videos is that almost without exception, it's men. Time after time after time after time after time, it's men who are doing these things. Every one of those men took action, and they were able to do so because of their emotional competence. They set aside, intentionally or otherwise, their panic, their doubt, their fear, their anxiety, their own desires or needs, and in many cases, their safety, and they acted in the service of what they saw as a greater good. They acted out of compassion, something that men, I guess they just don't have. But they're willing to risk their lives in the service of that, often. That is the essence of masculine identity in all cultures through all times, the ability to master your own fears and doubts and take action, whether it's to track down an outlaw, murder a rival, avenge a loved one, run into a burning building, or leap into a river to save someone, to stand fast on a battlefield, to take responsibility for a female partner's well-being. So, I'm going to use an example of an 11-year-old boy who was recently raped by his then 20-year-old babysitter. The perpetrator had been sexually involved with the boy's father, and she knew the boy's age. But somehow she managed to convince the judge that the boy had convinced her that he was actually 15. And somehow the father's testimony that his son was, he's sex mad and saw the incident as a notch on his belt was given more weight than the boy's own testimony that he didn't enjoy the experience at all because he knew it was wrong. The woman was given a suspended sentence. Yes, no jail time. She has to register as a sex offender, but only for 7 years, and her probationary supervision and restrictions will only last for 2. Her defense attorney had this to say. She was vulnerable, and she'd had a hard upbringing, spending 2 years in hospital with leukemia between the ages of 5 and 7. The judge added that she was very emotionally immature, and that reduced the age difference in terms of relative levels of emotional development. So the conclusions in this case are as follows. The boy essentially wanted it and was not harmed by it, even though by his own testimony he was, and he didn't. The woman was at the mercy of her own emotions, which she could not be expected to control because the circumstances of her life had been difficult. The boy managed to convince her that he was not 11 but 15, despite the fact that she knew he was 11, and so he brought it on himself. He said, I'm 15, so he caused it to happen. Men commenting on the case are much more likely than women to say, I only wish I was that kid, or lucky bastard, or any number of other sentiments that erase the fact that this boy was a victim of something that he did not choose or want. That's what we call hyperagency. That's what we call assuming that everything that a man encounters in his life is something that he wanted, something that he caused, something that he earned, something that he did. There are very few cases where the difference between the assumptions and expectations of masculinity and femininity are more clear than this one. Masculine identity centers almost entirely around perceptions of agency, one's own perceptions and the perceptions of others. And feminine identity, and this is where it's going to get toxic, is much more capable of assuming object status. And let me be clear, I'm not using the word object as a synonym for dehumanizing. That's the way feminists use it, but that's not what it is. There's a very good paper, actually, that discredits all of their rhetoric on objectification, and if anybody wants a link to that, I can provide it for you after the talk. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to go by these basic definitions. Agents make things happen. Objects have things happen to them. A great deal of our cultural discourse around men and women, including a huge amount of feminist discourse, is about the things men do and the things women suffer at the hands of men, reinforcing men's status as agents and women's status as objects. Admitting that you have been victimized, that something has happened to you that you did not want, choose, or cause in any way whatsoever, well, it's just a lot easier for a woman than a man. It's much easier for others to accept that and acknowledge it regarding women than men, because it doesn't conflict with our cultural and biological perceptions of what is a woman. A woman can be a victim and still be perceived as a woman. A man cannot be a victim and remain a man in the eyes of others, and often even himself. This is particularly true regarding the ways men are vulnerable because they are men. I can't even convey to you the number of times I've managed to convince a man that yes, males are the majority of victims of violence in every single society on the planet. Males, no matter the gender of the perpetrator, women or men, violence is more likely to be perpetrated on a male than a female. And that pattern begins before age 1. Basically, it begins when babies start to crawl. That's the point when their parents start hitting boys 2 to 3 times more often than they hit girls. And that man will stick to his guns and insist that violence is a bigger problem for women, and that society doesn't take it seriously enough, that the VAWA and the thousands of beds in shelters and the mandatory arrest policies and all of that doesn't go far enough to deal with the problem of violence against women. And they will often say this moments after they have conceded that violence is a larger, more ubiquitous problem for men, and even when they have accepted that women are as likely to be violent with men as men are to be violent with women. If toxic masculinity is exemplified by the assumption that men cannot be real men, if they are victims, then toxic femininity is the assumption that women are uniquely victims, and that their identity as women is partially defined by their victimhood. Their victimhood at the hands of men, at the hands of patriarchy, at the hands of the beauty industry, at the hands of rape culture, male privilege, toxic masculinity, and institutionalized sexism. It is the assumption that the multitudes of studies demonstrating that they are often not unique victims, that men are equally likely to be victims of sexual and physical violence, sexist assumptions, negative stereotypes, rigid gender expectations, all of that, that these studies are wrong or false or problematic or not to be believed. I can't begin to tell you the number of times I have actually convinced a black man that driving while black is actually driving while black and male, and that it would probably never happen to his mother or his sister. And he will admit that. Yeah, that would probably never happen to my mom or my sister. But I still don't think I've ever been discriminated against for being male. And it's probably still harder on my mom and my sister to be black. Anything to not be seen as a victim or a potential victim because you are male, because that, my friends, means that you are not an agent, and therefore you're not a real man. It is women who are acted upon. It is women who are objects who do not act, but rather endure the acts of others. If women are the victim class, then a man who admits to being a victim cannot remain a man. When it comes to interactions with the opposite sex, the tendency is even greater because of that pesky notion that women don't actually do things, but instead have things done to them, while men are the ultimate cause of things happening. What could undermine a man's sense of agency, which is so central to his cultural identity, to his social acceptance, more effectively than being raped by an object, by someone who can't do things, by someone who's seen as ineffective, seen as not an agent? Much better to treat that rape like a notch on your belt and pretend to revel in the high fives. So you can see this in relation to physical violence too. A man hits a woman, there's no excuse that can ever justify it. There's nothing she could possibly have done to deserve it. A woman hits a man, I wonder what he did to deserve that. I bet he was cheating on her. Maybe he was getting fresh with her. All of these actions we will attribute to him in our own thoughts, kind of automatically. That will transform her action into a reaction to some initial action on his part that we imagine he must have done. Our instant assumption is that her violence was provoked or self-defensive or even due to some other thing outside her control, like PMS or a mental disorder, or because we still, because we will resist seeing her as an agent in whom a desire to act can actually originate and then be acted on. So our assumption regarding the victimized man is that he chose or caused what happened in some way, or at the very least, he could have taken some action to have stopped it from happening. He remains the agent, the hyper-agent in the scenario. So let's go back and see what we can discern of toxic femininity in geek feminism's list. The idea that male-female interactions are a competition, not cooperation. What is feminism? What is it but the demand by a minority of women to do away with male-female cooperation and redefine men and women as opposing teams? Redefine marriage as an institution designed to exploit women for men's benefit. Redefine the sexes as if they were nations at war. The first inklings of this mindset can be found in the Declaration of Sentiments, and they linger even now in feminism's constant lament about wage gaps and the lack of female representation in STEM or on corporate boards. The assumption is not a patriarchal norm. It's not. It's a feminist one. It's not toxic masculinity, it's toxic femininity. Or this one. Though not reinforced much in fictional media, in real life it is widely expected that a man would abandon his pregnant girlfriend and is incapable and or unwilling to take responsibility. Traditional masculinity has been constructed largely to hold men responsible for the children they help create. It was a masculine ideal among men. In fact, it was part of what could be considered to be a tradition of masculine honor, socially constructed and institutionally reinforced by males themselves. If there are any feminists in the audience, I would like to ask you, do you agree with legally enforced child support? Do you think men should be held legally, financially responsible for children they didn't agree to create because they gave their consent because they didn't give their consent to the obligations of parenthood when they agreed to have sex? More than this, what about women? If she didn't want kids, she should have kept her legs closed. I mean, we've all heard if he didn't want kids, he should have kept it in his pants, right? What do feminists have to say about that, right? About women wanting to opt out of the responsibility that they took on. You know, they made their choice. If they made their choice when they had sex, like men do, then all of these things that feminists have brought about, the morning after pill, abortion, safe havens, all of this stuff, right? Wouldn't that be toxic femininity? Wanting to get out of your responsibilities? Assuming, having a whole system based on the assumption that you would want to get out of those responsibilities? For women, sex and reproduction have been completely decoupled. Well, there is such a thing as an accidental pregnancy, there is no such thing as an accidental birth, and there's very definitely no such thing as accidental motherhood, since even after birth, women have both a de jure and a de facto right to absolve themselves of the responsibility of parenthood. Motherhood is not the result of an accident, And it's certainly not the result of something men do to women through the massive, immense patriarchal power of their ejaculations. Not in this day and age. It's the result of a series of unilateral decisions on the part of any given woman. No woman in the West is forced to consent to becoming a mother just because she consented to sex. Yet feminism has only further codified the patriarchal norm that men should indeed be held responsible for the children that they had a hand in creating, despite the fact that nowadays women hold unilateral power of decision over whether or not they themselves will become parents. When I talk about legal paternal surrender, the impression I get from feminists is that a man's single decision and action to ejaculate is to them more powerful than a woman's entire gamut of autonomous reproductive choices. He got her pregnant. And the baby? The baby just happened. Again, we force men into the role of active agent. And, they can affect those around them. They affect those around them just by existing. And women into the role of passive object at the mercy of outside forces. And if an abortion is more difficult or costly to obtain than a haircut, well, she's a victim of that too. We assign him agency even when he doesn't have it, and we hold him responsible, yet for all her power, she is still the victim. So here we kind of come full circle. If much of toxic masculinity is based on the assumption that men are indeed agents, much of toxic femininity is based on the assumption that women are objects who are acted upon and therefore they are unique victims. And this is where things get sticky because, as Warren Farrell said once, men's greatest weakness is their facade of strength and women's greatest strength is their facade of weakness. So why? Why would this be? Why do we see men and women in these ways? Why do men avoid being perceived as victims, at least in terms of being victims as men, while women increasingly seem to revel in an identity steeped in how they are acted on? In my opinion, it's for the same reason. Societies have always gone out of their way to preserve women and children, often at the cost of men's lives. It's just male disposability. A feminist recently posed the question in the comments section of another feminist video, why are women cold all the time? Why does the air conditioning make me shiver while my husband feels just fine? And I told her, the answer is, because for the most intense period of human evolution, the Pleistocene or the Ice Age, a period where half a dozen other bipedal hominid species went extinct, but not us, women shared their immediate environment, including its hazards and comforts, with their much more vulnerable children. While women can survive the cold as readily as any man, they are more sensitive to it because their children could not survive it. Being sensitive to the cold meant that women were alerted to the risk to their children and motivated to act on it. And that increased the chances of survival for their kids. On the flip side, men were expected to venture far afield in all types of weather to bring in food, and for men during that period, being insensitive to the cold was what increased the chances of his children's survival. That is just how we evolved. We evolved in tandem. We evolved in roles that were reflected in a division of labor. And that brings me around to Lady Macbeth. That bit of Shakespeare that I quoted in the beginning is an archetypical literary example of toxic femininity. A woman hungry for power and status above her own goads her husband to act on her behalf. She goads him by undermining his masculinity. She goads him through shame. She goads him by revoking his man card. At the end, she goads him by telling him she's more of a man than he is. She's more honorable in her promises and more willing to sacrifice something dear to her in order to preserve that honor. Shakespeare knew men and women at least that well, though I've often wondered over the last 5 or 6 years, if his view of Lady Macbeth might have been a bit rosy. Because later in the play, driven mad by guilt over her role in the murder of King Duncan, she committed suicide. And I've always wondered if a fan fiction alternate ending might actually be more realistic. One where she feels no guilt, and where standing on a field of the dead, her own husband among them, she attaches herself to the nearest, next powerful man, and regales himself with stories of how Macbeth was a cruel and vicious husband who was not capable of loving her properly. And why would I think Lady Macbeth would do that? Because she can, yo. Thank you very much.